Today I want to share my research on Lithuanian case about ritual spaces introduced by the late Soviet atheist politics, as I argue, and I also have an expectation to test how unique this phenomenon is. Is it only because from my findings it shows that in Lithuania, as a strongly Catholic country, it gave some unique examples of such architecture and such spaces. This secular Soviet state was well known for its elaborate socialist rites instituted for the life's milestones from birth through marriage to death. Actions traditionally carried out in a sacral space were rather quickly assigned to consumer services and were replaced by the civil registration of the newborn child, the secular wedding, and funeral rite. Administrators of the new rituals insisted that these ceremonies neither derived from religious rites nor were they intended to replace them. The challenge, therefore, was to create secular spaces designed to offer appropriate settings for weddings and funerals while avoiding any kind of religious presence. However, it seems that tradition in a very broad sense influenced the new architectural spaces created to practice new secular socialist rituals. For a cultural historian, these buildings, wedding and funeral palaces, might be interesting from several points of view. On the one hand, they represent purest socialist architecture since they were purpose-built to serve the Soviet society, and therefore cannot be researched apart from the ideological matters. On the other hand, artistically, they represent elaborate buildings of the late socialism that had a very clear artistic program to create an emotional impact. In the paper, I argue that these buildings were substitutes to sacral spaces. A wedding palace substituted a Soviet church, whereas a funeral palace was an interpretation of a cemetery chapel. So I call them certain simulacra, filled with surplus meanings and decorations. Most of the Soviet initiation rituals date back from the 60s. And it is different compared to, for example, compared to the Stalinist fight against the church. Because atheist policy, which was especially strong in Soviet Lithuania, because of the rather influential Catholic Church that was very active in the resistance movement after the Second World War, changed substantially during the Khrushchev era as compared to the real fight against the church in Stalinist period, to the more sophisticated policy of creating attractive substitutes for the church. For example, song festivals, youth events, and introduction of new traditions that were officially called as based on the ethnographic origin, meaning that they had deeper roots before the Christianization of a nation. On the mass scale, most of these initiation rituals also date only from the 60s. And it explains why these purpose-designed types of buildings began to spread in many Soviet republics only from the 70s onwards. For example, in Lithuania, the Lithuanian Board of National Tradition was established in early 60s, which published the book Civil Ceremonies. But if we compare the book from the 69 to that of 79, The first was illustrated only with ornaments, because there were no spaces or buildings or halls that could illustrate the book. And 10 years later, we have many colorful pictures of new ritual buildings and halls. So it shows that in 10 years, a lot of ritual spaces were created. And Soviet Lithuania in this context played really a role of an experimental place, since the first purpose-built wedding palace in Vilnius and funeral palace in Vilnius served as prototypes of functional type, modernist aesthetics and symbolics for the entire Soviet Union. In many Soviet cities and towns, institutions for civil marriage registration were simply placed in the rooms of the municipalities or institutions or collective farm clubs. So it was the only place where a couple could be married officially. And the registration in this way quickly lost its festive aspect. Communist Party ideologists strongly believed, it's very interesting how they perceived the religion, but they strongly believed that people go to church because of the emotional reasons, and therefore put religion into the sphere of feelings. Therefore, emotional impact was one of the goals of the new ritual buildings. In the early 60s, several civil marriage registration bureaus were already established in Moscow in 61, in Leningrad and Novosibirsk in 66, that were defined by the more festive character and interior, because they were established in former palaces of the noblemen, and they started to be called wedding palaces instead of the civil registration hall. However, one might say that a proper architectural environment for the Soviet wedding was yet not clearly defined. Therefore, I think that this construction of the first purpose-designed and purpose-built palace for the civil wedding ceremony in Vilnius is both exceptional and illustrative. In this context, because its founding is very explicitly justified by the second secretary of the Lithuanian Communist Party, Valery Karazov, who was complaining that there are no, I'm citing, no beautiful buildings for marriage registration in the capital city. Therefore, people prefer to marry in the church. And soon there was the plot for the palace designated in the place of the former Lutheran cemetery, and a young modernist architect was hired to design a building with no financial restrictions. The initial idea of the modernist architect was to design a completely new and modern type of building that would resemble no other building before. But later, his colleague revealed that this novelty was somewhere between the town hall and the church. And in this case, emotional impact of the building was associated with the original sculptural form, as you can see from the picture, whereas the interior should have a more festive character. And yes, we can see that the building was a contemporary and elegant appropriation of Western late modernism, employing plastic shapes and a concept of developing building into the park, as you can see. But more important was this organization of the interior, because functionally, architect also had to create all the ceremony and the dramatism of ceremony. So here you can, and also he had to organize those flows of ceremonies for the wedding and for the newborn child registration. And functionally, he separated the festive part of the first floor, where he directed the flow of people starting from the symbolic bridge staircase, leading through the waiting and ceremonial halls, and back to the staircase, leaving the hall as a newlywed. But in this script of the scheme of newlyweds route, of course, he had to use already directions of the National Board of Tradition, which came to help scripting the standard ceremony in detail. All the administrative procedures were located on the ground floor, which was little seen from the outside. The interior of the building was decorated with monumental arts, especially designed furniture and textile decoration in the lobby. And here you can see the special designs. These textile compositions symbolically should resemble the day, the morning, the midday, the afternoon, and the night. But if we come back to the traditional perception of festive space, we can see two halls here. The hall of wedding registration and the hall of birth registration. And both of them have the specially designed stained glass background and specially designed tables, which were called by the furniture designer and an architect a ritual table or an altar. They said that registration of the marriage at this table emotionally should have equaled to the marriage at the altar in the church. It was a great success. It was featured in the catalog of the best Soviet buildings of the year in 1975. And mostly it was valued because architects were able to create new ceremonial spaces with modern architecture, not with the citing historical elements or other things, but employing modernist aesthetics. And here you can see this main marriage hall with a specially designed stained glass and ritual table. And this tradition gave impact for other Lithuanian towns. It became a rule that a palace of weddings should be specially designed, not standard designed, not type designed building, and built in a separate ground with the halls, and very originally designed with elaboration of interior design. As you can see, a wedding palace in Klaipėda, but the scheme remained almost the same, the stained glass in the background and the ritual table. Or an interesting thing, the reuse of original cemetery chapel in Anykščiai by the same architect Gediminas Baravykas, which was really original and not used before. Here you can see also the interior. One of the interesting things that the National Board of Ceremonies, of Traditions, insisted that a ritual table should be repeated in all the halls of the Lithuania. And also the background wall should be decorated. And here I'm very happy to be able to use pictures made by Lithuanian photo artist Vilma Samulionytė, who has this project, 60 Monuments. She visited now in the course of 10 years, she visited all the halls in Lithuania that she found, 59, and photographed all these interiors. So I can now quickly show you how this tradition was followed. And the path of Newlywed, the route of Newlyweds was also very important. And you know that this tradition became common to many Soviet republics, especially in the 70s and 80s. And as a tradition, it became a rule that it should be specially designed building and very sculptural building, beginning from the outside and then leading this emotional impact into the interior. So it's an interesting phenomenon of architecture of the Soviet period, illustrating both the social and cultural context of the epoch and its architectural and the mentality, but also introduction of new Soviet tradition. And the ideas behind the designs of these buildings were extraordinarily strange, as architects needed to invent original types of buildings that hadn't any traditions before. And also I want to show one more picture, how in the post-Soviet time it remains very strong in former Soviet Asian republics. You can see the civil registry building in Ashgabat, and we can only pay attention to the year when it was built and its size and originality again. Whereas wedding palaces started to be really popular in the entire Soviet Union, then the funeral palace, to my research so far, shows that it is specificity of Soviet Lithuania. And because already you can see the spread of this booklet, Civil Funeral, in '66, that had the same justification. Why should people need local, secular, nicely decorated places for farewell ceremony? Because in Lithuania there was the tradition that people collect together and mourn together for 2 days, and then the passed away person is taken to the cemetery. But the main impact why Communist Party ordered to build a new palace for funerals was that the party needed official space for official funeral ceremonies. And the young architect, Czeslavas Mazuras, who has just graduated, also a new modernist, got this task in '68, and he said, I didn't have anything to look at. It was such an interesting task, but it was very difficult because there was nothing to look at except of Czech crematorium, as he said, Czech crematoria. And actually, he could look also at the Russian crematoria, Russian Soviet crematoria, but it was a tradition that in the Soviet Union, not a specific type of building was developed. Only the halls where people could come together. And this story also is rather strange, that the story of the first crematorium in Moscow, in Donskoye, at the Donskoye cemetery, which presents a very chrestomatic case of Soviet iconoclasm in the form of reuse of the cemetery church. It is well known that none of the traditional religions, neither Orthodox nor Catholic, saw it acceptable to cremate a body. From this point of view, crematorium also served as a tool of atheism in the society, in the post-revolutionary society in Russia. And here you can see the crematorium that was established in the converted Church of Serafim Sarovsky and Anna Kashinska in Moscow. And the interior, and it has been reconstructed again into the church in 2000. But nevertheless, not a single crematorium was built in Lithuania during the Soviet years. So the architect was thinking in existential, on the existential level as he was talking, because he was thinking about the existential road to eternity. And his first designs were, he tried to emotionally create this impact of how a person feels its road to eternity. However, the Ministry of Consumer Services did not approve his first designs, and later there were many discussions how he should design, but finally he used the examples of modern Western modernist churches, and of course the Chapelle Ronchamp by Le Corbusier or St. Mary's Cathedral by Kenzo Tange, that were admired by Lithuanian architects of the time, were very strong examples. In the interior design, he tried to create a space for contemplation using modern arts. And this palace of ritual service, as it was called then, received a very positive response from the authorities and in the media. And the architect received the later commission to design an extension, mostly used for the pompous funerals of Communist Party and nomenclature members. For the funeral home in Kaunas, built in 1978, another architect, Alfredas Paulauskas, also looked for this individualized aesthetical expression. Its curved blank walls, akin in the aesthetics of the late Le Corbusier's works, was one of the popular solutions. And, but also I would take your attention to the sculptural form, very sculptural form of this building, and also the sculpture sorrow, as it was called then, a palace of sorrow. It again puts emphasis on a very strong search for emotional impact, how a building and interior itself should emotionally affect a visitor, a person. And here you can see the interiors with the help of indirect daylight and the half-light provided by these torch-shaped luminaries, also created certain spectacular system of chiaroscuro in the parlor and in the halls. But if we compare two plans of Vilnius and Kaunas palaces, you can see that number 2 indicates the very hall, so they are rather similar in size. And number 4 is garages, so the consumer services demanded rather standard spaces, standard offices, and standard services. And only the sculptural form had to mask these consumer needs. Even more interesting thing, I would say, even more interesting building is the series of funeral homes in Klaipėda, Šiauliai, and Panevėžys, a type designed by architect Gytis Tiškus, which reflects one more tradition or one more feature of late socialist architecture, especially in the Baltic states. This regionalist tradition or the folk tradition, which was against the glass box. The architects who had already experienced the modernist period of glass boxes, another generation or opponents said that glass boxes does not contain spiritual factor in them. And we need to come back to more sculptural or more traditional elements. So here you can't attribute those buildings to the purely folk architecture. It is elaborated. But one element shows this thing. Here you can see the funeral home in Klaipėda, where two halls are covered with those triangle structures. And they are connected by the metal element, the sun, which is directly borrowed from the folk architecture or folk elements, and openly relate to the sacral symbols of Lithuanian folk art. So in this context of the Soviet Union, this functional type is really unique, and it can be assumed to certain simulacra of incorporated both Baltic folk art, officially negating Catholicism, but also using its many traditional elements like stained glass, altar-like table, etc. So looking in a broader context, these new ritual buildings with their own symbolics are clearly close to the functional type of cemetery chapels. But in comparison to other objects of the consumer services, they demonstrate expressive architecture and interior features. So, in a way, architects do not escape much from the tradition in designing new types of ritual buildings. But on the other hand, they create something really Soviet architecture of a ritual. So one reason might be that in Lithuania, for the entire Soviet period, the architects were restricted from designing and building churches. So in a way, it might be also a result of sublimation, but it's only a hypothesis. So that's all.